this video is going to be a crash course in the ancient Japanese technique of Shibori dyeing, and you're going to learn 3 different techniques.
Here you can see the materials I used to complete the shibori process. Not pictured are rubber bands and some glass globs. Make sure you get a good porous fabric to work with. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and add 1 tablespoon to 1 gallon warm water, a pre and post wash for my fabric. I'm going to dip all of my fabric in here and let it sit while I stir it for a few minutes.
All right, so now that I have my fabric soaking, I'm going to keep stirring that every minute or so. You can also do this in the washing machine. I just chose to hand soak it. Now I'm going to be mixing up my dye, and materials I'm going to use for that. Everything I read said you need to use a N95 mask, so I'm going to be using that. I'm in a room with ventilation. I have an apron on. I have gloves on my hands. I'm also going to be using some non-iodized salt. The dye, I just got this on Amazon. And finally, I'm going to be using some soda ash.
To make my dye mixture, I'll start with salt, then add in soda ash, then finally add in the pigment. Now, as a disclaimer, I really liked how my pieces came out while they were wet, but once they were rinsed and dried, I felt they were far too light. So I'm going to go back and do this with a much denser ratio. I'm going to play around with this a little bit, and I'm going to get it so that my pigment turns out a lot deeper and darker. This first technique of Kumo Shibori is fairly simple. Here you can see I have some glass globs and some rubber bands. I'm simply going to place a glass glob everywhere I want to be the center of a ring or a circle, and then I'm gonna encase that in a rubber band. I can put on as many rubber bands and glass globs as I'd like. I could put them in a pattern. Here you can see I've chose to kind of randomly attach them together. The Itaheme technique of shibori was a fun one to complete. You basically are going to create accordion folds in your fabric. So here you can see I'm going the long ways. Once your fabric is accordion folded into one long strip, you're then going to continue the accordion fold in another direction. So you end up with something like this that you are going to sandwich between 2 pieces of wood and secure with some rubber bands. And finally, Kanoko Shibori is an easy one to complete as there's really no rhyme or reason to it. Here you can see me creating some folds. This is going to allow some symmetry in my design and perhaps create some interesting lines. And then I'm simply just taking my fabric, bunching it up, and attaching some rubber bands on. To dye my fabric, I dipped all of my pieces in the dye vat for about 30 seconds each, and then I took them out. And one of the things that I read was that you need to let it sit for about 15 to 20 minutes, come back, dip all the pieces a second time, and repeat as desired. The more you repeat this process, the darker it will be. Once you're done with this, you're going to rinse these with cold water to stop the dye from continuing to activate. You want to make it so that the water runs clear. The best part of this whole process is the reveal. As you cut your rubber bands, strings, wood, marbles off, you're going to be pleasantly surprised with each pattern you were able to create. With the itaheme technique, you're going to notice that it essentially makes a grid. For each of these patterns, I did 2 different versions. This one here you can see I used smaller folds and I folded them diagonally. And then on this one, I got a much more even and uniform grid pattern. And my folds were larger and they were parallel with the edges of the fabric. I think the Kanoko technique has been my favorite thus far because really all I did was fold and scrunch up my fabric. I didn't do anything special and I was able to get some really beautiful results. Once you're done, you're going to again rinse your fabric in that Synthrofull and water bath. And then I went ahead and dried mine in just a standard dryer. Overall, I love my patterns. I love how my designs turned out, but I'm pretty disappointed with the density of the color. I feel like a lot of it washed out and I'm not completely sure why. I'd like to go back in and try these techniques with a different dye mixture or perhaps even a different dye product altogether. This was not a true indigo dye. It was a fabric dye in the color indigo. So I think there's definitely some research on my part to be done with the perfect dye soda ash ratio so that I can get a really compelling final product. And what I've learned about Shibori through this process is that really anything goes. So go out there and have some fun.